Earlier in the course, you learned that JavaScript is a dynamic language. So we can declare a variable, set it to a number, and then change its type and set it to a string. And that's perfectly fine from the perspective of a JavaScript engine. This is one of the characteristics of a dynamic language. But we have the same concept in the arguments of a function. So I'm going to define a function here, call it sum, that has two parameters, a and b. And here we simply return the sum of a and b. Now let's do a console.log and call the sum function, pass 1 and 2, save the changes, so we get 3. But in JavaScript, it doesn't matter that this function has two parameters. We can pass only one argument. So in this case, we get not a number, because here a is 1 and b by default is undefined. So when we have un plus undefined, the result is not a number. This is not a valid arithmetic operation. The same happens if we don't pass any arguments. So we don't get an error, we get not a number as a result. By the same token, we can pass additional arguments. So in this case, we can pass, let's say, 5 arguments. And that's perfectly valid JavaScript code. So when we save this, we still get 3 because only the first 2 arguments are used. But what if you want to have a varying number of parameters in a function? What if we want to have the flexibility to pass as many arguments as we want and get their sum? Well, every function in JavaScript has a special object called arguments. Let's log this on the console, console.log. So this is the arguments object. You can see that it kind of looks like an array, but it's not an array, it's an object. But the keys we have in this object are the indexes of the arguments passed to this function. So the first argument is 1, the second argument is 2, and so on. Here we have a length property that returns the number of arguments that are passed. We have this other property, callee, which returns the currently executing function. So you can see here we have a reference to our sum function. So this is the arguments object. Now, if you want to have a function with a varying number of parameters to work with all the arguments that are passed to this function. So let's say we want to change this function to return the sum of all its arguments. Here's a very simple algorithm. So we declare a variable called total, set it to 0. Then we can use the for of loop. So let value of arguments. We can use this loop to iterate over this arguments object. Now, earlier I told you that we can use the for of loop on arrays, but technically this loop can be used on any object that has an iterator. So the plain objects that we create with the object literal syntax, they don't have an iterator, but this particular object, you can see here we have symbol.iterator. That means this object has an iterator, so we can use the for of loop to iterate this object. Now, for every argument, we're gonna get that and add it to our total variable. And finally, we will return total. Now, save the changes. We get 15. We can add another argument and we get 25. Now, here's the interesting thing. We can completely remove these parameters here because technically here we are working with the arguments object to access the arguments that are passed here. We are not referencing A or B anywhere in the body of this function. So we can simplify this code and remove these parameters. In the next lecture, we're going to look at a better way to implement this function.